In this sixth video, I want to focus on one challenging implication of the Church's teaching that every single human person has infinite dignity. And that is that even the worst people in the world also have infinite dignity. Even the people who have done horrendous and deeply inhumane things to others. Respecting the dignity of the worst is not only challenging, it may even be impossible at times, but it's also the measure with which we respect everyone's dignity. In a really, I found, compelling passage of Fratelli Tutti, when speaking about the immorality of the death penalty, Pope Francis says this: "Let us keep in mind that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, and God himself pledges to guarantee this." In that, Pope Francis is referencing the story of Cain and Abel, where even after he murdered his brother, God protects Cain from violence towards him. So let us keep in mind that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, and God himself pledges to guarantee this. The firm rejection of the death penalty shows us to what extent it is possible to recognize the inalienable dignity of every human being, and to accept that he or she has a place in this universe. If I do not deny that dignity to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. I will give everyone the possibility of sharing this planet with me, despite all of our differences. There's three things I'd like to point out here. The first is, when I was involved in the pro-life movement, I'd often hear a line that would go something like, if a society can't protect the dignity of the most vulnerable and powerless, the unborn, it can't protect the dignity of anyone. What Pope Francis is articulating here is the other side of that coin, and that is, if a society can protect the dignity of the worst of criminals, it can therefore protect the dignity of anyone. Second, we see the distinction in Francis's teaching between moral dignity and ontological dignity. So to refer back to my third video, where we drew from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, articulating different types of dignity, it talks about how moral dignity has to do with whether a person is acting in accord with their dignity as a human person. As all of us are very deeply aware, human beings can act in horrific ways. As the document on human dignity says, human beings can commit profound acts of evil against another. Those who act in this way seem to have lost any trace of humanity and dignity. And this is where we have in common language of someone who is that violent. We talk about them acting like an animal, like acting like something not human. However, even when a person acts in an inhumane way, they do not lose their ontological infinite dignity. The third thing that comes to mind from Pope Francis's passage here is Matthew 25. And in Matthew 25, we hear Jesus telling about the second coming and how when he comes again, he will judge all the peoples of the world, and he'll judge the righteous and the unrighteous, the sheep and the goats. And the criteria for judgment in this parable isn't a profession of faith or what sacraments a person received. Not that those aren't important, but the criteria for judgment in this parable is how I served others. Specifically, if I gave food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, if I welcomed the stranger, if I clothed the naked, if I visited the sick, and I visited the imprisoned. If I did it to one of the least of these, I did it to Christ. That's what Matthew 25 says. In this, we see Jesus identifying himself with the imprisoned, and not those in prison unjustly, even those who are rightfully in prison because of the horrendous things they did. Christ is explicitly saying that he is present with them and in them, and in respecting them, I'm respecting Christ. I want to pause here and acknowledge how challenging a teaching this is. It's provocative. You may not only be feeling a level of friction in this teaching, but outright animosity, especially if you or a loved one has experienced acts of abuse or violence from other people. I want to pause and say that God isn't demanding our immediate assent to this teaching. God is inviting us to open our hearts and to hold space for this proclamation, to consider that if every human being has infinite dignity, then even the worst of people have infinite dignity. He's inviting us to consider it. He's not demanding blind obedience. I recall one of my favorite passages from Pope Francis is in Evangelii Gaudium. He says this: "We can wonder if God is demanding too much of us, asking for a decision which we are not yet prepared to make. This leads many people to stop taking pleasure in the encounter with God's word. But this would mean forgetting that no one is more patient than God our Father, that no one is more understanding and willing to wait. He always invites us to take a step forward, but does not demand a full response if we are not yet ready. He simply asks that we sincerely look at our life and present ourselves honestly before Him, and that we are willing to continue to grow, asking from Him what we ourselves cannot as yet achieve." There's a second point I want to make here, and that is that respecting the dignity of the worst offenders doesn't mean making myself a floor mat. It doesn't mean letting someone else trample over my own dignity. In fact, working to resist, working to take away power from someone who is misusing it is in fact respecting their dignity as much as it's respecting mine. In a really important passage from Fratelli Tutti, in the section on forgiveness, Pope Francis says this: "Nor does this mean calling for forgiveness when it involves renouncing our own rights, confronting corrupt officials, criminals, or those who would debase our dignity. We're called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us, or letting him think that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of a power that he does not know how to use and that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. Forgiveness does not entail allowing oppressors to keep trampling on their own dignity and that of others, or letting criminals continue their wrongdoing. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family, precisely because they must preserve the dignity they have received as a loving gift from God. If a criminal has harmed me or a loved one, no one can forbid me from demanding justice and ensuring that this person or anyone else will not harm me or others again. This is entirely just. Forgiveness does not forbid it, but actually demands it." Here we see in a really explicit way the Pope addressing how sometimes, too often, the language of forgiveness can be used in a really insidious way. The ways that language of forgiveness and love and mercy can be used to keep people who are being oppressed in places of oppression, to keep people who are being oppressed from demanding justice, from keeping themselves safe. But here we see in this teaching that respecting the rights of those who misuse their power doesn't mean allowing my own dignity to be trampled on, but it precisely means working to remove them from power. I have the right to defend myself. I have the right to demand justice, to demand better.